it's really about focus.
Right.
Like, man, I mean, there's all the things, whirlwind is going on. Like, I can't remember which author uses that commentary of like the whirlwind, but
I think it's 4 Ds of execution.
I think you're right. But that's the whole thought. It's like, man, this stuff is always going on. Like, there's always movement. There's always, situations that we're dealing with, stuff to do, execution that's going on. But it's like, man, we've got to pick our heads up as leaders to be able to say what's going to move the needle most. And that's, I feel like, the question that we need to be waking up thinking about, like, really every day, know, but like, especially as we're thinking about quarterly rocks, if we're putting 90 days of effort to something, man, I hope it's what moves the needle most. I would hate to think that, I read this quote of like, it was D.L. Moody actually, I wrote it down. It says, our greatest fear should not be a failure, but of succeeding at something that doesn't really matter.
Right.
And I'm like, man, how often do we fall into the trap of like, man, we're just reactionary and doing a bunch of stuff that doesn't really matter. And I just think as leaders, there's always things to do, but these 90-day rocks, getting specific, what are we chasing as the most important things? And are those the things that we're waking up thinking about?
Right.
Because that should be driving us.
This is Breaking Barriers, where we help pastors and churches grow so that they can go.
All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Breaking Barriers podcast. This is Pastor Bobby. I have Pastor Brant Gordon. This is Brant's very first time on the podcast. So welcome, Brant.
Man, glad to be here. Man, been exciting to hear all the different podcasts we've been able to do so far and just connecting with the different churches that we've been able to be a part of. And man, I'm just pumped to be able to be on here today.
Yeah. So today's podcast, I wanted Pastor Brant to come on because he thinks about this stuff really well. So here's what we're going to talk about today. How do we, as a church, reverse engineer the goals that we're trying to go after? And what I mean by that is, when you think of reverse engineering something, you basically think of like, okay, if I'm trying to get to a certain place 5 years from now, as an organization or even as a leader, like in your personal life or with your family, if I'm trying to get somewhere 5 years from now, or if I'm trying to get somewhere 10 years from now, how do I reverse engineer the process it's going to take to go from where I'm at right now to where I want to be 5 years from now? And the idea of reverse engineering is, you begin to kind of like set some milestones so that you back all the way up so that you know what the most important thing for you to be doing next week is based on that vision 5 years from now, based on that vision 10 years from now. So Brant thinks about this stuff really well, even in his personal life. Him and I have had lots of discussions around this. And so what I want to do today, we probably could do some follow-up episodes on this, but I really want to share kind of 5 things to think about when we're thinking about trying to reverse engineer goals for our church. And I will start out kind of introducing it like this, and then I'll turn over to you, Brant. I think a lot of times, all of us are wired differently when it comes to like vision, execution, that sort of thing, And a lot of times in an organization, you're going to have people that are very visionary. A lot of times, more the lead pastor role, the CEO role, those are oftentimes thought of as people that are more visionary, they're able to look out into the future 5 years from now, 10 years from now, what are we trying to see? You have other people that are, really great at just like executing on the day-to-day like tactics of what it takes to get there.
Yeah.
But like in any organization, like you need the whole spectrum of, man, where we're going 10 years from now and what it's going to take to like really execute on that tomorrow.
Yeah.
And so I would just say as like a general introduction, like for anybody that's listening, it's good to think about like, okay, where am I at on that spectrum? Where is our organization at on that spectrum? Because some churches are great at execution, maybe not as good at vision. Some churches are just amazing at vision, but not as good at like the execution, the day-to-day execution of the vision. So, man, I don't know what comes to mind to you just when I kind of introduce it like that.
Yeah, man, I think it's so important, like understanding that we need each other, that like we're part of a body, and God has given us all different giftings, obviously spiritual gifts, but I think even in terms of wirings, like God has uniquely wired each one of us. And some of us are going to really be leaning in towards this, high visionary, but some of us are going to be really focused on the execution. You get a ministry, or family, or church that's focused all on visionary, and it's like, man, we're talking all day about what could be, and we're not doing anything.
Right.
And at the same time, you get a ministry or church organization family and they're focused so much on doing, they're never picking their head up, and they may not even be doing the right things or the
right.
things that
That's
they
the
want to
thing.
be doing.
Yep.
So, I think as leaders, like, we have a responsibility to really understand who we are and how we are bent in that, but also a responsibility to learn the people around us. How are they wired, and how can we kind of collectively work on this together so that we're bringing the best out of one another for the sake of the organization, so that vision and execution are all happening. And that's when you really start to like see everything begin to get traction and start to move.
Yep. Yeah, totally. So one good illustration, I think this is just an illustration I've had in my mind over the last year as I've been thinking about like what it looks like to reverse engineer goals. So we are in Greensboro, and the PTI airport here in Greensboro, they've been doing a ton of development at the airport. So basically just extending land at the airport to get different vendors to come in. And so over the last probably 5 years, there's a company called Boom Supersonic, and they have this huge vision to, basically over the next 10 years, create a commercial airline that are doing supersonic flights. So basically, breaking the speed of sound, whatever that is, 700 miles an hour or whatever. For many, many years, there actually was one of these, the Concorde, and they did a ton of flights from the U.S. to Europe, but there was a couple accidents, and so the Concorde ended up shutting down. And so there's actually not that right now. There's not a supersonic flight. And so they had this huge vision to do that. And I share that because, one, I drive by the airport every day coming to the church, and our church is right near the airport too. So when you're thinking about reverse engineering something, they have this goal. Okay, there's not a commercial airline that does supersonic flights right now. We have this 10-year goal of that's where we're going to get. That's like that's a huge goal. But like, you don't start with just like building an airplane at the airport, you start with, which is what's happening right now. They have recently, over the last 6 months, built this like ginormous building that anybody can see at the airport because, they're in step 1, step 2, step 3 of this long-term, man, if we're going to get to supersonic flight, we got to have a place to build these planes and house our engineers and house our mechanics. And, you don't start with, building the engine to the jet that's going to be the supersonic flight. You start like way in the background. And I think that's just a good example. So as a church, like when we're thinking about, maybe you could share a little bit about our vision as a church. So for Mercy Hill, we've identified, okay, our 10-year vision is, we want to see 5,000 baptisms and 500 people sent out over the next 10 years. Like that's where we're trying to go.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to kind of add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, again, it's like, man, you got to come back to, well, where do you want to be, and then where are you now?
Right.
And there's a gap there, obviously. Like there should be a gap there. We're growing people. We're a growing organization. And if there's not a gap there, it's because there's a lack of vision. But if we have a good vision and goal in mind, as we think about our 5,500, we've got to then look around and say, well, where are we at now? And what will it then take to get there? What does it look like? So for us, like it looks like a thriving college ministry. And it looks like us beginning to, even as we're talking about right now, setting goals around college ministry and what it can look like and baptisms that we want to see out of it, knowing that, so many baptisms will come out of a thriving college ministry, and also knowing that so much sending will end up coming out of college ministry because college students, as they graduate, they have the most flexibility to be willing to go and jump on a mission trip or a go team or long-term opportunities as well. And so, for us, I think there's, it begins to, you can't do everything. I think that's the key in this. Like, as you think about vision and then reverse engineering, there's so many things that we can be, picking to do and going 1,000 different directions. And I think this is what crushes an organization or church, any type of movement, when there's not alignment and really deciding and determining what do we actually need to do to get there. If you don't do the work of that, then everybody ends up, kind of like judges doing whatever's right in their own eyes.
Right.
So I think it's, those are some ways that we've done that, but I think that, there's a multitude of ways of reverse engineering and bringing it back.
Yeah. So when we're thinking about five ways to kind of reverse engineer, the starting point is kind of what we're talking about here is like, you need an ultimate direction, and that don't have to be a 10-year vision. That can be for a younger church, it could be a 2-year vision or it can be a 5-year vision, but you need to identify, and we're not talking about mission here, because like at Mercy Hill, like Pastor Andrew used to always say, hey, we just want to be faithful. And it's like, yeah, there's something right about that.
Agreed.
In terms of the mission. And that's how a lot of churches are. They're just like, man, we just want to change the world. And it's like, man, there's nothing wrong with that. But like,
what does that mean?
A vision is a what by when.
Yep.
You know, like, so for us, it's like, we want to see 5,000 baptisms by 2032, and we want to send 500 people out of Mercy Hill. So that what by when, not only can it inspire people, but it also allows us to measure, like, how are we doing? You know, like, are we 10% the way there? Are we 50% the way there? When you just have something nebulous as a vision that's like, man, we want to change the world, I mean, it's hard to just kind of know like how you're doing. And so we want something that's very specific out in the future to say, man, this is our North Star. This is where we're going. This is the ultimate thing that we're trying to do. It's very clear for all of our people. Like, we're not doing 1,000 things. We're doing, this is the one thing that we're going after.
Yeah.
It's hard to reverse engineer until you have something like that.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, you know, there's probably various reasons why churches don't have that. And I think sometimes it's, maybe, you know, we don't think that way, or the primary leader doesn't think that way. I think sometimes it's a lack of effort maybe to think through that. That's, you know, time, because it takes a lot of time and effort to really focus on that. I think being true to who you are as well as an organization, like, none of us are all things, you know? So like, you know, thinking that we can be the church that does a billion things, we essentially become Golden Corral instead of Ruth Chris.
Right.
And so I think doing the work to be able to say, hey, this is who we are, we're comfortable with who we are, I think begins to then be able to set the direction for, hey, this is where we want to go. Understanding, man, the church is like, we are just one church among a multitude of churches across the face of the earth. We don't need to do everything. Like, God hasn't called us to do everything. He has called us to make disciples and multiply churches. And so I think that focus for us then generates, what does it look like to actually do that? The vision of it, kind of the mission of make disciples, multiply churches, and then the vision of, you know, 5,500 by 2032 is what it actually looks like to get there.
Yeah, for sure. The second one, and I think this one can really be a challenge for people, you know, like after you have, you've identified that ultimate direction, you know, so maybe for a church, it's, hey, we want to see 100 people baptized over the next 5 years, right? Or we want to plant a church over the next 5 years. That's our ultimate vision. Once you identify that, then I think something that's really important, and this is hard work too. I mean, it's not necessarily time consuming. It's just hard because it really gets into us, is like, okay, where do we need to grow as an organization? Because there's probably some stuff standing between where we are right now and where we want to go in the future. So I'll give some examples. Like for Mercy Hill, you know, once we identified this 10-year vision of, you know, 5,000 baptisms, 500 people sent out, there were just multiple areas immediately that we were just like, man, we're going to have to get better at discipling people around money and discipling people around giving. It's like, man, that vision is going to cost a lot of money, you know, like, man, we're going to have to get better at raising up volunteers, you know, to become a church that's going to see that many people baptized and that many people sent out. It's going to mean just like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of volunteers that we are going to need to raise up, that we are going to need to lead. There's probably 100 other things, but it's just sometimes I think we can kind of assume, well, if we just keep plugging away, we eventually are going to get there. And the reality is, like, no, there's a reason with churches and just in life in general that, like, growth barriers, you know, a lot of churches get stuck at 200, they get stuck at 500, they get stuck at 1,000, they get stuck at 2,000. There's a reason that those growth barriers are there. Yeah. Because there are things at different sizes that a church is going to have to change. Yeah. And it starts with, like, trying to recognize, like, where we're actually kind of falling short, which is hard to do sometimes. Yeah.
I mean, I think for even like individually, like for us as people, the honesty that it takes to be able to say, like, hey, there's things that aren't where I want them to be in my life. There's things about me and my leadership or things within my life that I'm struggling with that aren't ideal to who I believe God wants me to be in a preferred future. And I think the honesty of that can be really hard. I mean, we see this, you know, all across, I feel like, even culturally, where, through distraction, and all kinds of different routes that we run to avoid that honest discussion with ourselves. And I think churches, we can do this. We can kind of trick ourselves into what you just said. We run the same play, and we're just going to see growth,
right?
And maybe, but probably not. And generally speaking, even within our lives and within each organization, every season demands something different. God is growing us, and should be, rightly so. We've got to be willing to engage in the change that needs to occur within our lives and within our organizations, and understand that is going to be hard and difficult. But hard does not mean bad. Like, it's something worthwhile to like push into for our own individual growth as we think about personal leadership. But also, it's something that, like, if we want to reach more people, make more disciples, if we want to see everything grow, it's not going to be, your church can't function the same way at 500 that it did at 100.
Yeah.
5,000, it can't function the same way as it did at 3,000. And if you're not willing to engage in the difficulty of, honest assessment of where things are at, and willing to shift what needs to be shifted to be able to get there, then, you won't grow, because you'll hit that barrier and you'll say it's not worth it.
Yeah. So like the real applicable thing to do here is like, once you nail down a vision, write that on a whiteboard somewhere, and then just, get before the Lord and people you trust and your team and say, where do we need to grow?
Yeah.
Because for like a lead pastor, I think this could be a good example. Like the future vision may require that you have more courage than you have now.
Yeah.
That fear may be holding you back from going after the things that God has put in your heart. Even something like, we just don't want to say this, even something like, you may need to be a better communicator.
Yeah.
Like, you may need to work on that. Like, I think over the last 13 years, like, Pastor Andrew's a great communicator when Mercy Hill started, but he's done a ton of things to try to get better at that.
Yeah.
Because it's like, man, to hit that vision that we want to hit 10 years from now, it's like, man, we're all going to have to get better. Like, we talk about this on our leadership team a lot. Brant's on our leadership team here at Mercy Hill. Like, we're going to have to get better. Like, as the church gets more complex, as we have more staff, as there's more money, more responsibility, more stewardship, we're going to have to become better leaders.
Yeah.
Like, we can't stay where we're at to be able to hit those goals that we want to hit in the future.
Yeah, and I think we've got to do that, like, reckoning within ourselves a little bit, and I think we've also got to be able to get past the point where we can kind of differentiate, like, the things that we need to improve on and grow in from, like, our sense of self-worth and value, because I think that's a big hurdle for everybody, leaders especially. I think we put so much value in, like, what we do, that sometimes when it's like, hey, we're not where we need to be, there can be this, like, immediate sense of, like, well, I'm fighting back on that. No, like, I don't want to talk about it, and I don't want to deal with it. But, like, God wants our growth. Like, He wants to grow us. He wants to grow what God is, what He's doing around us for our good and for His glory. And to do that, we've got to be able to say, like, hey, I'm going to be honest with where I'm at, and I'm not going to get so caught up in my pride and my self-worth that I can listen and I can hear for the sake of my growth from the people around me and as the Spirit's leading me.
For sure. So number 3, and this is where you start kind of getting, I guess, where the rubber meets the road a little bit, is like, after you have that vision, hey, this is where we're going 10 years from now. Here's some things that are limiting us right now, some areas we need to grow. After that, you need to start having some strategic milestones. And so what I would say is, so going back to that boom supersonic illustration from the beginning, like, if they're going to need to get there 10 years from now, there's going to be some things that they're going to have to hit by year 1, by year 2, by year 3, by year 4. Now, some of those things are going to change once they get into it.
Yeah.
But the way that I would describe it is, it's basically putting a timeline on your vision.
Yeah.
So it's saying, hey, another way that I think about it is like, okay, I grew up in Florida. If I were to drive from Florida to California, there would be some strategic points that I would have to hit along the way to know if I'm heading in the right direction, right?
Yeah.
So being from Florida, if I'm making that drive and all of a sudden I find myself in Maryland, it's like, okay, man, Maryland is not on the way from Florida to California.
The compass is off at that point.
Exactly. So once you set that 5-year vision, that 10-year vision, Now we got to break it down to smaller kind of bite-sized pieces. And this is a lot of what our leadership team does here at Mercy Hill is trying to, and we've done it lots of different ways. We've used lots of different tools, but it's identifying, hey, over the next 2 years, here's the 4 most important things.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
Yeah. So, even the example of like, so many people set New Year's goals and they're like, man, I'm going to lose 20 pounds. And it's like, okay, well, what are you going to do? Well, I'm going to lose 20 pounds.
Right.
It's like, well, like if you don't know how you're going to get there,
right.
you're not going to hit the mark. You're not going to get there because you're not giving yourself a chance to succeed. And so the way that we really break this down, I mean, we think about like where we want to be long-term, but then we really break that down into, well, what does it look like in 3 years? So we have a 10-year goal, 5,500. But in the next 3 years, where do we want to be? And then kind of coming back to, well, in the next year, what does that look like for us as a church? And I mean, even like this year for us, it's 5,000 first-time guests that we want to see across the church. And we know, man, in order to see, the 5,000 baptized, everybody's a first-time guest at some point. Everyone that hears the gospel, everyone that's sent out. Like if we want to see 500 people sent out from this church, it's like, man, they're going to have to come through the doors and identify themselves as they begin to get involved at the church. So we're like, man, this year we really want to focus. We've got a strategic opportunity, with the building of our Ridge campus that really fits well into it. And the Ridge campus is a part of our long-term goals as well, fitting in within that 5,500 to get there. But we really felt like this year, man, leveraging that opportunity with that campus, leveraging different events to just get people around the body. And if we can get them around the body, the chances of them taking the next step of involvement, of jumping on a serve team, of hearing the gospel and being baptized, man, it just grows exponentially. And so for us, like I said, we can focus on a bunch of different things to get to 5,500. And not everything it's not like a right or wrong. It's hey, we're picking what we've prayed about and what we've talked about and believe that is the best choice for us to get there.
Yeah, so I'll just give you an example. So going back to about 5 years ago when Pastor Andrew and I were thinking about, this long-term 10-year vision of 5,500, we just talked a lot, and we sat and we talked, and we just, we wrote down a bunch of stuff that we wanted to see happen, 20, 30, 40 things. And then we forced ourselves into this conversation. Man, we hope all these things happen. They really paint the picture for where we're trying to go. But for that 10-year vision, what is the absolute 4 most important things that we want to see happen over the next 3 years?
Yeah.
And we're kind of on the other side of that now. We've seen most of these things happen, but I'll just walk through them with you really quickly just so people can see the example of this. So the first one was like, man, our vision as a church has to get better.
Yeah.
Like it needs to become more sticky. The more people you have, the more watered down everything can become. A vision is a very strategic tool to be able to get a lot of people on the same page.
Yeah.
And, the larger you become, the more important it is to have everybody on the same page and not a bunch of people going different directions. And so step 1 of the 4 things we want to see over the next couple of years was like, man, we got to have a crisper vision.
Yeah.
And that's where the 5,500 came out of that.
Yeah.
Like we didn't have that before. Like we didn't have something that sticky that could be repeatable. So we're like, man, vision's got to get better. We're a multi-site church. So, one of the things we recognized is like, hey, we can't just be growing at one of our campuses. Like we got to try the best that we can, that our campuses are healthy enough that all of our campuses are growing, because like there's no way we're hitting 5,500 if all of the campuses aren't reaching people, baptizing people.
Yeah.
So there was a focus on the health of our campuses. We launched our deeper discipleship initiative. So one of the things that we recognize, I said this earlier, like, hey, we're going to have to really level up when it comes to discipleship around generosity and giving.
Yeah.
Because we personally as leaders need to grow in this, and our people need to grow in this. And this vision that we feel like God's given us, it's going to cost a lot of money.
Yeah.
And so we launched a 2-year discipleship initiative kind of like because of that. We're like, hey, we got to do this. Like we got to go after this as a church. And then the fourth one is, wanting to see this 5,500. And we've known this for a long time. We're like, man, we have got to have a space that seats more than 500 people.
Yeah.
Like we're a multi-site church. We have multiple campuses, but in terms of our home and hub, like, man, we just needed a new space.
Yeah.
And it's like, we're going to have to figure that out. It's very important. You don't see a lot of churches getting to that 5,000, without increasing their seating capacity.
Yeah.
And so that was one of the things that we identified. Now, we did a lot of other things over the last 3 years, but these were always kind of like right in front of us. Like these are the things that Andrew and I are talking about, our leadership team's talking about. We're always saying, okay, based on these 4 things, what do we need to do this year? And that brings us to number 4, which is, man, after you have some of these milestones laid out, now we're talking about executing over the next quarter, over the next 90 days. And this is really your world and our leadership team's world. It's all about, man, what's happening over the next 90 days to get us where we're trying to go a couple years from now.
Yeah. So I think for us, like we meet regularly, quarterly with our teams to make sure that they're thinking about this. We want them to understand what the 1-year goal is. We want them to understand all of it, but really with the focus of the 1-year goal, then going from there to develop our 90-day rocks. Again, it's just reverse engineering this. It's every step. It's like, well, what's the next milestone that we've got to get to be able to get further down the road towards that 1-year goal? And, as we think about and really try to empower the staff, our directors, to be able to think through their 1-year goal or their 90-day goals, sometimes we'll bring things to them. We want them to understand kind of as a leadership team where we're headed, what our 90-day rocks are, and what are the key components that maybe flow down within the ministries, and let that influence them. And then we want them to also be thinking about the 1-year goal and what's going on within their ministries. There's also things that, whether it's a staff transition or whether there's, something that they need to do to be able to accomplish, the goal for the 90 days to be able to further the mission for that 1 year. Think about this even with like our Ridge launch. And we've got, huge goals, around the Ridge launch, knowing how big of a part that is of long-term 5,500, but our 5,000 first-time guests this year as well, and the health of the church. And so for us, one of our goals, one of our quarterly rocks is to have 800 people on our launch team for the Ridge campus. And that's this quarter. Like, hey, over the next 3 months, we are working on a plan and beginning the work of what it will look like to have an 800-person launch team. A major goal, but it's going to influence how everybody else thinks about, how our kids team thinks about their goals, how our, guest experience team thinks about their quarterly rocks, because as they're building these rocks out, they want to, have the main important things coming down from us, and then they're picking out and trying to prioritize what the main 2 or 3 things are for the quarter. It's really about focus.
Right.
Like, man, I mean, there's all the things, whirlwind is going on. Like, I can't remember which author uses that commentary of like the whirlwind, but
I think it's 4 Ds of execution.
I think you're right. But that's the whole thought. It's like, man, this stuff is always going on. Like, there's always movement. There's always, situations that we're dealing with, stuff to do, execution that's going on. But it's like, man, we've got to pick our heads up as leaders to be able to say what's going to move the needle most. And that's, I feel like, the question that we need to be waking up thinking about, like, really every day, but like, especially as we're thinking about quarterly rocks, if we're putting 90 days of effort to something, man, I hope it's what moves the needle most. I would hate to think that, I read this quote of like, it was D.L. Moody actually, who's, I wrote it down. It says, our greatest fear should not be a failure, but of succeeding at something that doesn't really matter.
Right.
And I'm like, man, how often do we fall into the trap of like, man, we're just reactionary and doing a bunch of stuff that doesn't really matter. And I just think as leaders, there's always things to do, but these 90-day rocks, getting specific, we talked about SMART goals with them, but what are we chasing as the most important things? And are those the things that we're waking up thinking about?
Right.
Because that should be driving us.
Yeah, so I remember 2 years ago when, we were trying to go after one of these goals of trying to, help our campuses grow, make our campuses more healthy. Like, we were just writing down just like tons of ideas on paper, like, okay, what are a bunch of small bite-sized pieces to be able to kind of hit this larger goal?
Yeah.
And I remember that year, it was 2 years ago, one of the ideas was like, hey, I'm just going to do a reading group with our campus pastors.
Yeah.
Like, it's not super complicated. It's not rocket science, but I'm like, hey, I'm going to have to grow. They're going to have to grow. Like, man, we're just going to read a book on organizational leadership every month,
Yeah.
That's a good example of like a 90-day goal, a 90-day rock. It's like, hey, it's a small kind of bite-sized piece to this larger goal that we're trying to go after.
Yeah. So, we've had, one of them has been like, make a hire. There's a certain staff role that's important to, that we don't have, and we need to make that hire. Some of them are, Even hey, like, you know, we're getting ready to go into you know, a season where, you know, we've got some transition or stuff. It's like, you know, sometimes it's like, hey, we need to redevelop your ministry handbook like over the next quarter. That's really important to make sure everybody's on the same page, is redeveloping your handbook. But it's the working on it, not in it, is kind of the concept of a bit of a rock. It's like, it's not just the regular things you're doing. It's something outside of that is going to drive this goal forward, drive the ministry forward in like a new or unique way. And so, you know, I think about if it's like for example, a church may have like a new membership class or like some type of onboarding, you know, kind of thing. So like a good rock maybe is like, man, like, hey, I've got, you know, we want to see a lot more people go through this to get involved. So we're going to spend the next quarter and we're going to redevelop and implement a plan for a new onboarding experience. You know, and if that's like, hey, your long-term goal has to do with, you know, people getting involved, it's going to require that. That's a great 90-day rock to say, hey, over the next 90 days, we're gonna redevelop this and implement it at the end of the 90 days to be able to see a chunk moved in the right direction.
Totally. Yeah, totally. All right, number 5. And all the things before this were important, but I think this, when it comes to just like success, this is the most important. And it's just relentless execution. Like, you got to have a vision. Like, you have to have a vision. You have to have this long-term where we're going. But like, the only way you're going to get there is like relentless execution. Like, it's 90% of the work. It's just, it's faithfulness, you know, it's day in, day out, doing the work of the ministry and trusting that God is going to add to your number, you know, and not, it's the unglamorous, the stuff that nobody sees. You know, it's like, man, putting your time into sermon prep, like, you know, putting your time into learning, putting your time into growing, like, you know, doing the one-on-one follow-up, like executing on getting back to people. Like, it's just very basic, you know, like when you think of somebody that ends up, you know, becoming great in sports or something like that, like, you always have the example. I think Kobe Bryant is such a good example, you know, because it's like, win the championships, all of this, but like, you would talk to his teammates, you know, or other people that were on Team USA with him, and they would just talk about like, man, he's out there like 4 a.m. every day, like practicing, you know.
You wanted
like,
it more.
Yeah, like it's the grind. Like, it's like the, man, just relentless execution. Like, yeah, you got to have the vision, you got to know where you're going, but like, you got to execute on it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, for leaders and especially people that lean vision, this can feel boring. And you know what I mean? I think that needs to be said, because I think that's probably somewhat of the reason that leaders struggle with the execution, is because, you know, a lot of visionary leaders, we love the new. We love the like, man, I want to go for what's out there. I want the new thing. And we get very easily tired or you know, bored with what the other thing was. But is you know, if we're picking the right things, you know, for Kobe Bryant, it's like, man, him like picking to go practice and saying, hey, I'm going to be somebody that just practice this over and over and over again. It wasn't the like, he's doing 1,000 new things. It was, he figured out what worked and he just did it over and over again. And it's like, that's where actually like the, you know, everything really gets better over time. You know, you mentioned just no one's like an overnight sensation, right? Like, it just doesn't exist in the world. It takes effort, it takes work, and we've got to be willing to do the like faithful things over and over and over again. Understanding, like, I mean, it's kind of even like, man, our work is to the Lord, not to man. You know, and so it's like, man, we stick with it. You know, we go after it. I mean, I'm like, if Kobe Bryant can go after this for basketball,
right?
Like, understanding like we are children of God, and like the church and the mandate, the mission that God has given us to like partner with Him in this. It's like, man, should our drive be like any less than what Kobe Bryant's drive was to like score a basketball and win a championship?
Yeah, it's just like staying engaged day in, day out. Like, Pastor Andrew and I used to joke. I'm not gonna mention the church, but there was a,
you sure?
Yeah, I'm not gonna mention their name, but we had a little inside joke. You know, like they're a mega church, super successful, but like, it's like every year it was like this new initiative they were doing. Yeah. You know, it's like there was just like,
we love the new, man.
Yeah, like you go learn from them. and then you would go back next year and they're not even doing the thing that you learned from them anymore. Like they're doing something totally different.
So everybody went and implemented the thing, and then they come back and it's like, oh, we're in a whole different
yeah,
thing.
Exactly. And sometimes you need that, but I think for the most part, like Pastor Andrew is just really good at this, especially over the last 5 or 6 years, like just saying like, hey, guys, we're in this for like 30 years, not 3 years.
Yeah.
You know, like let's not get impatient here. Like, man, let's have some patience to just like till the soil. I remember reading, this is just a good illustration of this. There's a long kind of origin story of the company Amazon.
Yeah.
And I think it's called Amazon Unbound maybe. And one of the things that just struck me about the book, especially just the way Jeff Bezos is wired, like, you know, now you see Amazon, right? And you see like, man, this massive worldwide company, and you know, you see that they're in like Amazon Prime, they're in like videos and
they're
movies.
in everything, man.
You see like, man, they're into like data storage on the internet and all this stuff.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of these branches of their company, they started because Jeff Bezos had this thing where he would be okay for a division to not be profitable for like 5 to 10 years at a time. So like,
wow.
it was like he was playing this crazy long game. Like,
wow.
man,
yeah.
You know, the thought of like, okay, Amazon Prime is going to compete with Netflix. You know, Amazon Prime wasn't even a thing. And it was like, man, you know, 3 years in, we're still not there. 5 years in, we're still not there. 7 years in, we're still not even profitable. And it was like this crazy commitment to like the long game.
Yeah.
And I think that's like what relentless execution is all about. You know, it's because like you said, it's can be boring. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It can be boring. Like, man, I need something more exciting. I need to change things up. But it's like, no, why do most of us like Chick-fil-A over McDonald's?
It's consistent.
Yes.
Every time.
Because it's not because Chick-fil-A has some grand vision that McDonald's don't have. It's because when you go in there, you know, man, the execution.
Yeah.
Like they're on it.
Yeah. I think about this in my life though, just like, so I've started picking up golf again. And I played years and years ago.
Golf's a good example of this.
I loved playing golf. I had kids, and now my son's getting old enough to play again. And so we're starting to go out there and, just have fun. I love playing. But, what do you notice like with golfers? It's like, you can go out there and what do you need to do to get better at golf? It's like, okay, I need to go to the range.
Hit a lot of golf balls.
I need to hit a lot of golf balls. I need to be out there putting. I need to spend time out there playing. But what do golfers end up doing? Like the casual golfer, what do? Man,
go up and go.
I'm not playing good.
Rip it and rip it, baby.
But they're like, I'm not playing good. So what do? Man, I'm going to go buy a new golf club. Like, man, I'm going to go buy a new driver.
Right.
I'm going to buy a new set of irons.
Yep.
And it's like, bro, that's not what you need. You need golf lessons. And like, you need to just get out there and be practicing and working on your golf swing. And that's where the success is actually. So I've like really pushed myself. I actually did buy a new driver, so don't judge me for it. But I've tried to push myself to, it wasn't new, but I pushed myself to really like think about, man, I need, if I want to get better at it, if I want to enjoy being a better golfer, I need to put the time in. I need to be at the course. I need to be at the range. I need to be playing some.
That's a good example.
And I can't short circuit the growth that needs to happen there by thinking, oh, if I get the shiny new object,
right? Because
fix it.
Yeah, what a lot of churches do. I mean, it's just like it's so easy to do this. Like, a church is 30 years old, and before they know it, they have 50 programs, right?
See it all the time.
Instead of, hey man, instead of launching a new program, how about you decrease the amount of time it takes to follow up with people? You know? Like,
100%.
Like, how about adding a staff member so that when somebody signs up to get baptized, you always reach out to them the same day they sign up, no matter what day it is. Like, there's stuff like that where it's like, man, instead of doing more, we're going to continue to do what we're doing. We're just going to do it better.
Yeah.
And that's relentless execution. You know
It is. It's focused on, man, we want to be as excellent. I mean, for the glory of God. It's 1 Corinthians. It's like, man, we want to do all things for the glory of God. It's like, man, we want to do this excellently for the glory of God. And it's like, it's less about doing a bunch of things. Like, man, there's churches that are doing a bunch of things everywhere. Man, figure out as a church, what are you good at? Like, how has God uniquely designed like your leadership and your church body and, man, what he's put on your heart to go do, and focus on that and let other churches focus on the other things that they're good at. Rather than thinking I've got to be everything or I've got to add the new thing to be able to grow. It's like, man, just be like unique to who God's created you to be as a church. Be okay with that and be the best at that you can possibly be. And I think that's when like really success over time shows up.
Yeah, totally. So one closing thought that I'll give, and you mentioned this earlier, Brant, is just like, I think once we realize this whole spectrum of like, man, having a vision all the way down to like relentless execution, we realize, man, we're not all wired to be good at all of the parts of this, And so one resource that comes to mind is like the book 6 Types of Working Genius, that book just, it outlines like what work looks like, to go from vision all the way to like execution.
Yeah.
And, if somebody's in a more leadership role at a church, executive pastor or lead pastor, we really need to organize our team around, hey, we got big idea people, we got visionary people, and then we got people that can really execute on the vision, because we need it all.
Yeah.
Like, it's all extremely important to be able to go after the goals that you actually want to go after. So, Brant, thank you for being on the podcast.
Had a blast, man.
Hey, I'd encourage you guys. We're going to be talking a ton about stuff like this at our conference in September. So if you are not signed up, I would encourage you to come to that. Any final thoughts, Pastor Brant?
Man, I think, again, just be okay with who God's made you to be, and also understand that he wants to grow you, and be okay with that too, and like run after that. Understand the uniqueness of who you are, and who your organization is. And I think that's the key to success long term.
Love it.